Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Favorite Hill, and I'd like to welcome you to East Bay MUD's Water Wednesday. Tonight's topic is ripped straight from the headlines. It's searching for the sewage signal, how East Bay MUD contributed to water-based epidemiology. And before we get started, a little housekeeping. This production will be recorded and posted to East Bay MUD's YouTube channel. And I'd like to introduce you to tonight's speakers. First, we have our Director of Wastewater, Eileen White, and Alicia Chakrabarty, who is our Manager of Environmental Services. And since this is an exciting topic, let's get started. Alicia, sorry.
Thanks, and I'll go ahead and start with just a brief introduction of East Bay MUD and who we are as an agency. So we are a water and wastewater agency serving water all the way from Crockett in the north down to Castro Valley in the south. And then our wastewater service area is actually a subset of that region. From Steege Sanitary District, which includes Richmond Annex, El Cerrito, and Kensington, down to Oakland in the south. And that also encompasses the cities of Albany, Berkeley, Emeryville, Alameda, and Piedmont. Within that wastewater service area, we are serving approximately 740,000 people. And that is a clue for our first poll question of the evening, which is, on a dry day, approximately how many million gallons of wastewater does East Bay MUD treat?
Okay, Alicia, we'll give them a few seconds to answer.
Okay, great.
All right, looks like everyone has responded, and the results are, everyone is saying 550 million gallons.
Okay, and unfortunately that is true. Actually, on a wet day, we can get that much, but on a dry day, our average flow is about 50 million gallons. So that's equivalent to about 75 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Now, wastewater, why do we need treatment? There are two primary purposes: protecting public health and protecting the environment. So we want to protect people from the pathogens that are in wastewater, and we want to protect the environment by removing the organics that would otherwise deplete the oxygen and harm the fish when released to the environment. But what is wastewater? Well, in your home, it is anything you flush or wash down the drain. So lots of different sources. But wastewater is also comes from other uses. So not just your own household, but every water user within our service area flushes that water down. So restaurants, industry, manufacturing, doctor's offices, all of those create different contaminants that we must remove. And we do that through a complicated process. But first, the wastewater comes through what we call a private sewer lateral. So the portion of pipe that you own. It flows through the collection system pipes. So these are the pipes that are owned by the sanitary district or city. And then it flows to our large diameter interceptor sewers, where we take that wastewater and put it into the treatment plant. That at our main wastewater treatment plant, which is located at the foot of the Bay Bridge, it goes through various different steps. There are liquid trains and solids trains. And ultimately, we're trying to recover resources. So we see ourselves as a resource recovery facility because we are producing fresh effluent that is able to be discharged to the San Francisco Bay. We also produce 3 other products. We produce some recycled water for use in irrigation and some light industrial uses. We produce biosolids, which are land applied, which then return the carbon and the nutrients to the soil. And we produce energy, a whole lot of energy, which is used to power the treatment plant and also put out onto the grid. But now I just want to zoom back out before we get to those treatment stages and talk about the raw wastewater that comes in and how we've been able to harness that as a resource. And I'll hand it over to Eileen to take you on the cruise and tell you that story.
All right, Eileen, before we get started, I just want to say if we would like everyone to type your questions into the Q&A, and we'll answer those questions right after the presentation.
Great, then I'll move on to the Grand Princess cruise ship. And no, I'm not going to try to convince you to go on a cruise tonight. But what I would like to do is travel back in time to March 2020, when Covet was just beginning. And if you read the news a lot, you'll likely remember the Grand Princess cruise ship, which became, as the New York Times put it, as a floating symbol of America's fear of coronavirus. The Grand Princess is a cruise ship that was built in 1998 at a cost of $450 million. It was the largest and most expensive passenger ship built at the time. This slide shows a timeline of events from February through April 2020. And I want to walk you through it because it's important in how EBMUD got involved in wastewater epidemiology. The Grand Princess left San Francisco on February 11, 2020. It traveled to Mexico and returned back on February 21st. The ship had a quick turnaround that day and left on a second voyage to Hawaii with 62 passengers from the first cruise. 10 days later, people from the first cruise began showing symptoms of COVID-19. On March 2nd, a resident of Sonoma County tested positive. 2 days later, an elderly person with pre-existing health issues in Placer County passed away. In response, public health officials canceled the second voyage midway through and ordered the ship to return back to the mainland for quarantine. After several days of waiting outside the Golden Gate Bridge, the Grand Princess docked in Oakland on March 10th. The next day, EBMUD received a phone call. The operations manager for the cruise ship was desperate. He had a cruise ship that was filled with wastewater and he was at full capacity and he wanted us to take the wastewater. We quickly consulted the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, the state public health officers in Sacramento, and our local Alameda County public health officials to get guidance on how do we treat this wastewater with COVID that we didn't know much about and still protect our operators at the main wastewater treatment plant. We got the guidance and quickly mobilized and started testing the wastewater the next day on March 11th. Here's a photo of the Grand Princess cruise ship on the left, docked at the port in Oakland. On the right is the Grand Princess cruise ship leaving many weeks later and going out the Golden Gate Bridge. So there are 4 types of water on the Grand Princess as shown on the right: drinking water, gray water, bilge water, and black water. We only treated the last 3. So originally there was over 3,500 passengers and crew members on the cruise ship, and they accumulated over 400,000 gallons of wastewater that was being stored and needed to be treated. Fortunately, it had already gone through some treatment using the ship's on-site 2-stage bioreactor, but now it needed to be discharged and treated at our plant. So following guidance that we got from the public health officials, we went ahead and we made sure that we were maximizing dilution by taking it at a low flow rate and mixing it with wastewater that was already in our sewer pipes. We also disinfected the wastewater from the Grand Princess cruise ship using what we call sodium hypochlorite, which is basically bleach. And we did that before it entered the sewer system so that if any workers were working on the sewer pipes that they came in contact with the sewage, they would not come in contact with COVID. So basically, by bringing it in at a very low flow rate, it was only making up 1% of the total flow in the sewage pipes. It then traveled to the main wastewater treatment plant, where it underwent the primary and secondary treatment, followed by disinfection, dechlorination, and it was discharged into San Francisco Bay, as Alicia described earlier. So if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the wastewater monitoring. But I thought it was important to provide context on how we got involved in wastewater-based epidemiology, and it all began with the Princess cruise ship. So for decades now, as Alicia described, EBMUD and the wastewater industry have recognized that wastewater is a valuable resource. We generate our own renewable energy from the biogas, we use the nutrient-rich biosalts for fertilizer, and we recycle the wastewater for other purposes, such as water for irrigation, for golf courses, and for landscaping. But over the pandemic, we have learned that wastewater is also valuable in another way, and that's tracking the spread of the disease in the community. So people who are sick with COVID-19 shed the virus particles in their poop. This creates what's referred to as a sewage signal in the wastewater, which we can detect and monitor to inform us about the prevalence of COVID-19 in the community. As people flush their poop down, the waste enters the sewage pipes and in the sewer system. And the presence of COVID in wastewater, what we call the sewage signal, presents a remarkable opportunity for us to track the spread of the virus throughout the community over time and spatially. In other words, we can sample the influence of the wastewater treatment plant, and that will tell us the presence of COVID-19 for the 740,000 customers whose wastewater arrives at the treatment plant. Or we can sample particular areas. We can sample a nursing home. We can sample a dormitory. We can sample a hospital, and it'll tell us about the presence of COVID-19 from that particular sample, whether it's a dormitory or a nursing home. So the sewage signal represents the spread of the virus at the population level, not the individual level. And we still see the value in individual people getting tested. It just provides different information for public health officials getting the information from coronavirus within the wastewater system. So the sewage signal tells us what's going on for all 740,000 people who flush in our service area. As a result, the impact of the sewage signal is much larger than that of the conventional testing of one individual test. And this was particularly true at the beginning of the pandemic when testing was very limited, or even more recently during the holidays, during the peak Omicron, when it was difficult to get individual tests. So our next poll question is, at any point during the pandemic, did you have difficulty getting a COVID test?
Okay, we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer. Okay, it looks like we have all our results, and a little bit more than half said yes, they were able to get a COVID test.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Mona. And I think it just shows too, whereas the public health officials want to know what everybody in the community, not just the people who got testing, because as we all know, there's people who are asymptomatic, may not be showing any symptoms, but they're also carrying the coronavirus. And so that's another way the wastewater is very useful. So now I'd like to show you some pictures of some of the staff who are actually taking the samples. And this is EBMUD staff in the white coats and uniforms to protect them, because we all know that wastewater is full of pathogens. And we've been tracking the sewage signal at multiple locations throughout the pandemic, including our main wastewater treatment plant. But also, as you can see on the right, we've divided our service area into 3 different regions based on the network of underground sewer pipes. And at each location, we've installed a sampler, and that grabs a small volume of wastewater every hour. Then our staff, as you can see in the photos, mixes the samples together to create what we call a composite sample that's representative of the entire day. Because we all know, we all go poop at different times of the day and we all flush, but we want to be able to get everybody's representation. And that's why we want to take this composite sample of the entire day. And then the yellow circle here shows the general vicinity where we sample the wastewater at our main wastewater treatment plant. And we sample it at the influent pump station. And that's at the start of the wastewater treatment process. And for context, that's located near the MacArthur Maze, where West Oakland meets Emeryville. And here are some additional photos of EBMUD's inspectors taking the samples. And they've done a great job doing this weekly throughout the pandemic. And I want to give them credit because this is truly a dirty job working with wastewater. And we make sure they have all the protective gear to make sure that none of them get sick in working with the wastewater. And now I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about how we've collaborated with numerous universities and private entities throughout the pandemic. So our samples of waste have been shipped all over the United States. They've gone to Boston, Massachusetts. They've gone to South Carolina. They've gone to Arizona, to here in our own state. They've gone to Stanford and UC Berkeley. And we've been collaborating with these universities, with private companies such as BioBot, that's located in Boston, Massachusetts, and they're partnered with Harvard and MIT. And we've all been collaborating to better understand the presence of COVID within the community. And what we had to do is at the beginning of the pandemic is we had to make sure we were all getting defensible data. We don't want to just get data. It's got to be, we've all got to have a standardized analytical method. So we work collaboratively to develop with other wastewater utilities and labs to develop a standardized methods so that when these universities and public health officials get data, that we're all using consistent analytical methods and that the data is reproducible in good data that the public health officials can use to make decision makings on public health and what they want to do as far as guidance for the public. And recently, our collaborators have launched a website that displays data on coronavirus in wastewater for 11 counties in California. It's really fun and easy to use. You just select the county and the data range that gives you the results. So the next poll question, how do you think that the Delta variant peak compared to the Omicron variant peak in wastewater?
All right, Eileen, and looks like everyone is saying that Omicron was higher.
Okay, so here are what the results like for East Bay MUD's influent wastewater. And for its simplicity, I'm only showing the results from one of the 4 locations, and that's the influent pump station that gets the wastewater for all 740,000 customers. And the x-axis of this graph shows time from March of 2021 to the present. And the y-axis shows the concentration of the virus. And what you can see is the sewage signal mirrors what we have observed with case counts. Levels decreased significantly as people got vaccinated in spring of 2021 and into the summer. In August 2021, levels increased due to the Delta variant, but then came back down temporarily. Levels then increased dramatically with the arrival of the Omicron variant from December through January, and then came back down. It's really great that working with our partners that you can now get this data online. And that's a result of our partnerships with the universities and private companies.
We do have questions, and with such a large dilution factor for the waste, do you still have enough sensitivity in your test?
Yes, we do. And right now, that was early on in the pandemic that we were diluting it. So that's a great question to let me answer. We're not doing any more dilution. The only dilution we did was when we took the wastewater from the Princess cruise ship in March of 2020. We didn't know much, and so we wanted to dilute it, and we also wanted to add the hypo. Now what we do is what you saw in the photos of our wastewater inspectors who've done a fabulous job collecting the samples, is that we're not doing anything to the wastewater before it comes in. So there's no need to even do the dilution.
Okay, and let me see, is wastewater collected in septic tanks tested?
No, what we're testing only is the wastewater that comes into our wastewater system here in the Bay Area, at the foot of the Bay Bridge. And the partnerships I talked about, there's other wastewater utilities now that have joined on and are partnered and are providing wastewater samples. I haven't heard of any septic tanks at this point in time. I've heard of mainly wastewater utilities.
Okay,
that's a good question.
We have a couple of questions on this subject. Can East Bay MUD test for other infections, say flu or tuberculosis? And another question also asks about cholera in wastewater. Has this been done in the past, or is it planned going forward?
Right. So right now, and I want to clarify, right now we're taking the samples and they're being analyzed in other labs. So we're not, because other labs were able to build up their lab capacity. Early on in the pandemic, there wasn't the lab capacity, but now there is. That we're not doing the actual analytical work ourselves. But right now, is being screened for the Omicron BA1, the Omicron BA2, and they're looking for the flu. And our partners are thinking about other things they may want to look for. So right now, we're in the role of partnering with them to provide the actual raw sewage. And some of the private firms are thinking about how they might want to use this in potentially any other variants or even during the flu season. But originally the partnership just started off with for the COVID, and now they've gotten more sophisticated and are being able fairly quickly to mobilize and be able to test the latest variants. And we sample our wastewater anyway for other things every day. So I should be clear that this was focused on particular diseases, but I want to be clear, at our own district lab that we do have on site, we're sampling the wastewater to make sure that when we send it out to San Francisco Bay, that we're meeting all the requirements of our permits that we have. The regulatory agency is the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board and EPA. So we do lots of analysis on our wastewater every day to make sure what's being discharged into San Francisco Bay meets all requirements.
Okay, and now I'm going to go back for a question that was asked earlier. Well, it's more of a comment. 40% of people with COVID never get symptoms unless you tested everyone regularly. You cannot know none of your employees none of your employees got COVID.
And that's true, but what I was basing it on was what we do in order, they have to report to work every day. They're not teleworkers, unfortunately, our wastewater operators. So in order to ensure our safety, we're making sure that everyone fills out a form every day saying that they don't have the COVID symptoms. We have all the symptoms and they have to say they check no. And then we've also had testing for our operators, and we've also had a vaccine policy that we implemented. And based on the testing and all our measures, until December of last year, nobody had tested positive. But that's true. If someone didn't get tested and never had symptoms, it's possible somebody could have had it. But to our knowledge, nobody had tested positive and nobody had shown symptoms.
Okay, and why did the workers get COVID during Omicron? What changed?
I think what changed is that I think people started socializing. It wasn't just the wastewater operators, but our staff that get to telecommute, they were coming down with wastewater, coming down with COVID too. And this is, my hypothesis is if the people who are working from home are getting COVID and the people who are working at work are getting COVID, what is there? I think people socialized over the holidays, and the Omicron was highly contagious. We know that. More contagious than either of the two variants. And so that's what we attribute it to.
Okay. Are there any plans to partner with other universities in the future on this initiative?
We're always open to partnering with others. And it just so happens that we're very fortunate to have UC Berkeley in our service area. Stanford was also one of the leaders on this. So we were partnering with them really from, I think they were excited to get the cruise ship waste. I think we got the phone call from them like the same day we got the cruise ship phone call, and they were so excited. They were sending grad students over to take our samples and freeze them until they had their analytical. So it does not preclude us from partnering with others. As I mentioned, we've also done University of South Carolina and University of Arizona. So whatever we can do to advance the science and to protect public health, we're open to that idea.
Eileen, we have someone asking for you to go back to the slide with the local wastewater data.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Okay, I mean, the website for the I believe that you showed earlier, the website where you can go and find out about waste. There you go. All right.
Yeah.
All right, and next question. Was EBMUD the first wastewater system to explore this data?
Well, I'd say because we got the whole reason you probably wonder why is she talking about a cruise ship? I didn't want to hear about a cruise ship. Our journey with COVID began with a cruise ship. And so we were the first ones to really receive wastewater that had COVID in it. So that's how we started. And then I'm not sure who else Stanford was reaching out to at the time. They were one of the leaders in it, and Berkeley, but because we were kind of novel, that they knew that there was COVID in our wastewater, we suddenly, and we had developed working relationships with the Centers for Disease Control and the county health officers. That's how our entry into this began.
Okay, what is the practical use of the data? In other words, how does the public react when this data is gathered and published?
Well, and we're actually doing it more. I mean, now, early on, we didn't have all these, what I would say, websites when it was made public. That's only very recently that these dashboards have been developed. But throughout the pandemic, we have been working and sharing this data before we had sophisticated dashboards directly with, the State Department of Public Health, with Erica Pond, with the county, Alameda County, and with Contra Costa County public health officers, and with the Centers for Disease Control. And they wanted this data because it was informing them. And let me explain how they were using it. So they're monitoring what's happening with the COVID. And as they're seeing it increase, and they're like, whoa, if we're seeing it in the wastewater increase, and that means within about a week, and we were partnering with Kaiser too, you can expect your phones are going to start ringing. And that's people starting to feel symptoms. And then they'd say a few weeks later is when people would start showing up in the ICU. So especially when ICU beds were short, which have occurred many times throughout the pandemic, this became an early warning sign for them. When they started seeing an increase in the wastewater, they knew a week later they were going to get calls at Kaiser and the various medical offices. And then within 2 to 3 weeks, people start showing up in the ICU with very bad symptoms. And then the public health officers were using this to decide, do we need to go into more of what measures do we want to do to control the spread of COVID-19 in the community? Do we want to require masking? Where do we want to require masking? And then as we've come out of this last variant, they've been using the wastewater data to make decisions about lifting, the mask mandates. And I should just note, when we started this in March of 2020, and we were trying to get attention from others, and trying to show how useful it was, we were kind of pioneering this with a few others. It kind of was reflective. One of my staff reminded me, Eileen, did you note that in the governor's endemic plan that came out a couple of weeks ago, now wastewater surveillance is a part of it. And if you think about this, in March of 2020, no one had even thought about it really until we got the cruise ship arriving. And we were really, it all started because I was concerned for the safety of our workers, that we reached out to the public health officials and the Centers for Disease Control. So it began with being concerned about our own workers who treat wastewater every day, led to us taking public health to a new level for the whole community.
Okay,
and
so
that's what we treat wastewater for.
the next question is pretty much confirming, but so are there precedents for using wastewater to monitor public health, or is it new with coronavirus? So,
It's been used more widely in other parts of the world. They use it for other diseases they have. They use it for the opioid crisis. And so I think the Centers for Disease Control and Amy Kirby, her and I have done numerous webinars together, and she's leading it at the Centers for Disease Control. It's making the Centers for Disease Control wonder, how else do they want to use wastewater for protection of public health and to monitor other diseases? So I think this has kind of made them think more about wastewater being a useful tool.
okay, we've got a couple of questions about whether or not we know if testing is being done with wastewater in San Mateo County and with Central Contra Costa Sanitary District.
It's definitely San Mateo County down the peninsula. They've been partnering with Stanford, and yes, Contra Costa has been involved. We got them involved. We spread the word. So then the other thing, I was trying to get funding. I was reaching out to Stop the Spread in various organizations in March of 2020, and I was asked to speak on numerous webinars. And so we got a lot of interest from other wastewater utilities who got very interested in this, and like, wow, this is an opportunity to really, use wastewater as another way, as a useful tool.
Okay, and what is the current finding for Omicron BA.2.2?
What's your question, finding?
What's the current finding for Omicron BA.2?
And basically the latest data here in the Bay Area, so I'm only talking about our wastewater, it's very low. So right now we're not seeing it. I do know that in other wastewater plants I heard in the country, there's a couple places that are seeing a small uptick. There was an article, I think yesterday, and they quoted Amy Kirby from the Centers for Disease Control, but it was, it was not throughout the country. It was not all wastewater plants. I think there was 1 or 2 wastewater plants where they saw a small uptick. And what we do is we monitor trends. I've got the slide of results back up. And what we really want to do is look at trends over time. You want to see when you're starting to go up on the curve, when you're seeing it getting vertical, as you can see here, starting in December 20th. And then, so we're really monitoring trends. But as you can see this curve, I've got data up for this week. And basically, we're providing samples 3 times a week to labs. So we're not just sampling once a month, 3 times a week. And they want the data because things, as you can see in this graph, change very quickly.
Okay, and so that ties into what the levels look like right now with the mask mandate lifted.
Right, and so here you can see the levels right now and how they compare back to mid-January when we're at our peak for the Omicron, and then you can see the peak in mid-July of last year for the Delta, that we are, significantly low. So the public health officials in California are using this data to guide them in making these decisions.
Okay, is detection by PCR or by RNA sequencing?
Different labs have been, doing it, but they've been using RNA sequencing, and they've also been doing PCR. And we were doing PCR initially in our lab for a short period before other labs got the capacity to do it. So it's very similar to a lot of you who've gone out and done your individual tests, it's a PCR test. And this is basically like a pool test, but the one complication that makes this a little harder than the swab up your nose is you're working with wastewater, which is a complex matrix because you're dealing with pathogens.
Okay, in a previous presentation, you mentioned testing for drugs, legal and otherwise. Did this prepare you for the pathogen testing?
We didn't do that. I sorry if I misled anybody. That's where it's been used in other parts of the world. So we have not here used it, but yes, this idea of using wastewater to look for opioids and other drugs and other diseases is not a brand new idea. And in fact, early on in the pandemic, I was getting calls from Spain and England and Europe about what we were doing. So, I mean, we went beyond the US even. I mean, when this pandemic began, it was new to everybody, and was getting calls from lots of researchers. But wastewater has been used in other parts of the world for tracking diseases.
Okay, where else in the country is similar testing being done?
Well, I think now, so that we were involved with the Centers for Disease Control and trying to help get a bigger program throughout the country. And so the Department of Health and Human Services have done a couple pilots. And so there's lots of wastewater plants now all over the country from the West Coast. I've been on numerous webinars with the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, which represents the wastewater agencies in California, since basically April of 2020. And knowing that they could help, they've jumped on. So in California, there's lots of wastewater agencies, but in Boston, New York, we all partner. So we've all been partnering together. So I'd say throughout the country. And what's really great now is the CDC has really taken a leadership role in it.
Okay, and this question comes from former EBMUDder, Greg Chan. Did the 2 atmospheric river type storms impact your data, and how? And were there any results or data groups that really surprised you?
So no, the 2 big atmospheric rivers didn't. And basically, yeah, that's when, back to the question, on a day like today, we have 50 million gallons per day, but back on October 24th, 25th, that Sunday, Monday, we went up to above 550. So we had very high flows, but it did not impact, and we're taking samples so frequently, so it did not impact. And what was part 2 of Greg's question?
It was, sorry, I gotta go back down. Oh, what part of the testing surprised you?
I don't think there's been any real surprises. I think we've been pleasantly surprised how much it mirrors what's happening in the population and what you're seeing in the virus counts. I guess maybe what was a surprise is as we started reaching out to other wastewater utilities, and is how much people wanted to really help throughout the country. I mean, we've talked to people in Boston, New York, Arizona, Utah. So I think it's a real credit that there is really good people out there doing good public service work who really wanted to help during the pandemic. So I think how much interest there was in trying to help the public health officials and how open the public health officials were. I mean, I remember my first phone call with Dr. Erica Pond. It was Alicia and I said, Alicia, here, take notes with me, make sure I hear everything right. And here we're calling the Centers for Disease Control, and they were like, well, we're not sure. So we went from being the first with this cruise ship to really getting people, you keep working with people, is that they see the value of it. And now, they've got I'm not pursuing private funding now because there is private funding that's paying for all this lab work, and there's state and federal funding for this. So I guess it's wonderful, the collaboration. I guess it's just remarkable doing it at a time that's, can be kind of dark for people with this pandemic, and scary how people really want to help.
Okay, can you relate the amount of wastewater to the number of sick people?
I don't. What we do is we're now in the position of we give our samples to the labs, and they are monitoring over time. We're not that sophisticated yet. We talked to Kaiser, and Kaiser, who's located right here in Oakland, they were interested in it. I was talking to their head of research, but it was going to take a lot of effort, and they didn't think there was value in it at that point in time. So they felt the trending was enough.
Okay, which lab is doing the current testing and how frequently?
So it's 3 times a week, and there's lab work being done. It's a partnership with us, UC Berkeley, and the Department of Public Health in California. And then we also have a partnership that's also getting our 3 samples with Stanford University and Verily, which is a private lab. And they're looking at some other stuff within the wastewater to see what else they want to do. They're trying to be a little more innovative, but they're also doing all the other analysis.
Okay. Can the results of the test be used to identify new COVID variants before they have been identified by other means?
And that's a possibility. And that's something that Stanford is partnering with this private lab that's checking the wastewater to see what else can they find in it. They're kind of like detectives.
Okay. Do we still have government funding for continued wastewater monitoring? I believe you just got to that one.
Yes, the Department of Public Health is paying for all the analytical work.
Okay. Any indication of a so-called second wave?
So at this point in time, I still have the results slide up. At this point in time, no, but the reason we're sending samples 3 times a week, we had talked with our partners, how often, and they agreed things can change very quickly. But if you're getting data 3 times a week, that's allowing you time to respond. Whereas once a week, things can change very quickly, we see, and you can see this on this graph here, how quickly things can change. So right now, we're not seeing anything. The data is looking good. And we're thinking by analyzing, basically 3 times a week, that'll be enough time for public health officers to respond very quickly as need be.
Okay, you answered the first part of this question by asking about how often you test. The second part is, do major conventions trigger more intensive testing protocols?
Major conventions? So you mean like a conference? Is that what you're asking?
I'm just reading the question straight, and it's from an anonymous attending, so I can't get more details. But it would trigger, it does flow into the next question of, is wastewater from SFO and Oakland airports captured in testing as well?
Yeah, so all wastewater and the wastewater from Oakland Airport comes to our wastewater plant, and so yes, that's captured. San Francisco is part of one of the utilities that's involved in this, and so San Francisco is getting monitored, their wastewater along with ours, and the airports are getting monitored.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions about the other websites. Would you be willing to show us how to interpret and understand the COVID web graph? For example, from Alameda County on March 10th, also about from the CDC. Another question is there a way to tell what the trends are for different variants on these dashboards?
It's, they've created the dashboards, and whatever's on the dashboards is what they've had, and it's actually kind of new that these came out. And I would say they're trying to develop them more, but at the same time, they're responding to the pandemic. So we're not involved in developing the dashboards, and it's whatever they can put out. So as far as, if you have questions about interpreting, we could definitely try to help interpret. I think the good news is I can tell you the public health officials are monitoring this data very carefully. And so the good news is the data is going to the public health officials, And they're looking at this on a daily basis to help inform them in making decisions.
Okay, and the questioner did mean about large conventions coming into the area. Did that cause an uptick?
We haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen a lot of large conventions, but what you could do if you were interested is sampling right outside of a convention. And what I have noticed, I've gone to one back in August of last year, is that there's usually very strict protocols in place where everyone has to show that they've been vaccinated and everyone's masking. So I'm not sure we'd see an uptick, but we have not done that at this point in time.
Okay, is all of the data available on COVID web also part of the CDC's wastewater surveillance system?
Yes, everything that's in there, we've been part of CDC. All the data that is uploaded to the state website is also going to the CDC.
Okay, how is waste data diverging from case test data now that there are many testing at home and not reporting results?
Well, and that's a great question. And what I'll just say is that's one of the reasons actually the public health officials really like the wastewater right now, because there's so many people that are doing their own testing, especially back during the holidays when it was hard to get a test. So they don't necessarily know the results. And so that's how they're using the wastewater to inform their decision making. And I can't comment on how the wastewater data compares to home kits because I don't have the data from the home kits.
Okay, and are some communities equipped mainly with septic tanks?
There's within our wastewater service area, but as you get more into rural parts of California, rural parts of the United States, there's people with septic tanks. And so far to date, it's been, I think, primarily wastewater utilities where there's pipes that bring wastewater into an area that has been part of these wastewater surveillance programs.
Okay, and when cruise ships begin coming into the Bay Area again, will the waste be tested separately?
As long as there's no concern now, I don't think there's any big concern. I think, it was more just March of 2020. It was new, it was scary. We were going to lockdown here and we wanted to just take all precautions to protect our wastewater workers.
Okay, I believe U of A was testing at the frat house level at one point. Was this the based on your collaboration?
We did a lot of collaboration with, in particular, Dr. Ian Pepper at the University of Arizona, and we were just collaborating. We did some stuff with Berkeley where they wanted to sample downstream of Frat Row. We've been collaborating on our ideas on how to use it. We collaborated with San Francisco and the county on using wastewater to do analysis on jails. So there's been a lot of great brainstorming and sharing of ideas, as you saw early in the pandemic, how there was outbreaks at the jails, and had they been monitoring wastewater in advance, it could have been an early warning system. So I think the good news is we're all learning together, and we're all want to learn together and share and collaborate each other's ideas to help protect everybody.
Okay, this next question came from the chat, and I think it's geared toward Alicia because it asked about wastewater careers. Do you have any epidemiologists on staff?
No.
We don't.
There you go.
And, yeah, as Eileen described, our role in this is really taking samples at this point. Early on, it was helping, do some grant writing and trying to get folks excited. But in terms of analyzing the data, we leave that to the public health officials.
Okay, and why is wastewater data not included on the Department of Public Health's Department COVID dashboard?
Well, they've been developing. As I said, this has all been something. It's been a collaboration. It takes time. We've been partnering with the Department of Public Health since the beginning, but they've had all sorts of competing priorities. And so we leave it up to them. As Alicia described, and as I've said, our role now is we're providing the data, we're collaborating, but we don't control their dashboard and what they make available.
Okay, and I believe Alicia's answering this question as well. is wastewater, is East Bay Mud wastewater test results available in virtual real-time online? And if so, what's the link?
And we're making it available through, once again, the website. And I think we put that out there. Alicia said she put it into the chat, but yeah, we're sampling 3 times a week, and it's not our dashboard, but it's the dashboard of the Department of Public Health. And they try to keep it updated as quickly as they can.
Okay, folks, we have 2 minutes left. So that was a lot of questions. So thank you all for attending and for joining us tonight. And Eileen, I'm going to give you a minute to talk about this photo because it's a great photo.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank everybody for participating tonight. And it's not often you get people who want to spend their evening hearing about wastewater and COVID, 2 very different things, but I appreciate you listening. And I just wanted to share this historical photo from our archives. This is showing masked employees in our head office during the 1918 flu pandemic. And what's really great to see is that, you know, we made it through the 1918 flu pandemic, and we're making it through this one. And since that time, we've really learned how wastewater can be a really useful tool in guiding public health officials throughout the pandemic. And so we look forward to continuing to collaborate with others to protect public health, not only protect San Francisco Bay and public health with treating your wastewater, but if we can use wastewater to be a useful tool to guide public health officials through a pandemic, we want to do that. So thank you so much for listening. And we'll have to get some photos of our staff from this past pandemic. So hopefully in 100 years, people can talk about how they've taken it to a new level.
Okay, folks, let me go ahead to gallery view. Again, thank you to Eileen and Alicia for joining us tonight. This was an incredible presentation, and we want to invite you back for next month's Water Wednesday. It's going to be a very special episode. We will be discussing, giving you a drought update. This will be on April 27th, different than our usual 3rd Wednesday. April 27th at 6 p.m. back here for a drought update. And again, thank you for joining us for Water Wednesday. Good night.